long story short, we've got a guest to get in here. We got to rock and roll. Mr. Eoin Higgins, author of Owned. How you doing today?
How are you guys?
Doing well, doing well. You a Yankees fan? You guys are having a pretty good season. I guess every season is a good season when you've got Aaron Judge, though.
Yeah. So far, so good, although there have been some hiccups, as always. But, yeah.
Well, welcome to the show, Eoin. I've been really anticipating this conversation for a while. Appreciate you bearing with us, through
Absolutely.
some scheduling mishaps. Zach and I have been super busy on the road making some documentary content, but really glad that we were able to get this conversation set up, because if anyone's not familiar in our audience with Eoin Higgins' work, he's been a writer, a journalist for a while, but his new book is called Owned: How Tech Billionaires on the Right Bought the Loudest Voices on the Left. And when I saw that was your book, Eoin, I was like, that's a perfect collab waiting to happen. We obviously, call ourselves the grift busters over here at the Vanguard. One thing that we focus a lot on is exactly this phenomenon, right? People that started out as real impressive cheerleaders for the left or spokespeople for the left, commentators, whatever. But slowly but surely over time, they've drifted away from those values and principles and towards the right wing for whatever reasons. Your book gets into a lot of those reasons. It's a fantastic read, very relevant to many of the conversations that we've been having on the show, basically since the inception of the Vanguard. So can't wait to hear your thoughts, man.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I know that we've talked about doing this, I feel like, for a few years at this point, back and forth. So I'm glad we finally have the opportunity to. I think there's a lot of like crossover and intersection here with both of the things that we like to follow, especially as far as like, I guess maybe you would call it independent media criticism. I mean, there's something about criticizing and I don't want to say going after, but talking about these independent media creators and taking them seriously and criticizing them, that I think is actually positive for independent media in general, because it shows that you're just taking them seriously as opposed to just like, okay, well, whatever, we're all in the same quote unquote business, as it were, but like we're only going to go after like the New York Times, the Washington Post, because they're the only ones that like matter. I think that it's important to also take seriously independent media creators, because setting everything else aside, the current media environment that we're a part of is one where independent media has so much to do with like how stories are broken and how discourse is kind of dealt with, I think, across online, across like news media in general. So I think that's a good crossover there, just to be able to talk about that.
Yeah, one of the things, and there's a lot to parse through. One of the things that you brought up, and to get right into Peter Thiel, somebody you talk about a lot in this book, and it's something that's always kind of struck me as odd. Obviously the right wing doesn't care about hypocrisy. We've seen that a dozen times. We've seen that with Elon Musk and Matt Taibbe and all of the free speech stuff that you also cover in that book. But Peter Thiel, he was fundamental in getting Gawker just absolutely bankrupt, right? And it's something that I've brought up on air, and a lot of people who are my age and Gavin's age, they've never heard of Gawker. It was a little bit before their time. But my girlfriend, very astute, very media literate, she's an actual journalist, and, she's put me onto all kinds of stuff. And, she walked me through that entire court case when Peter Thiel started to become relevant again. And it was just so baffling that this is the guy that wants to rebrand himself as some sort of free speech absolutist, after he went on a very public vendetta-oriented campaign to finance Hulk Hogan's lawsuit against them. You know what I mean?
And that was for revealing that Peter Thiel was gay, right?
Yeah.
So in part it was. There's people that I talked to in Silicon Valley who are kind of like contemporaries of his, and people who know him, said that it was like partly about that because he didn't want to be outed, which I think is understandable, but also because he felt that they were portraying him as kind of like mentally unstable as well. They were bringing up like his affiliation with Ron Paul and, like all those racist newsletters and stuff. I don't know if some of your audience might be too young to remember that, and like, don't worry about that basically. But, he was affiliated with this guy, Ron Paul, who had like all of these racist newsletters, and Gawker through his Valleywag blog and through the Gawker blog exposed a lot of that. And just kind of made Thiel into a figure of fun. I think the thing about Gawker, what they really did that annoyed Thiel and other people in Silicon Valley, is that Valleywag was like this blog that treated Silicon Valley the way that, like Us Magazine treats Hollywood, right? It was gossip, and it was kind of paparazzi style, kind of like just going after them. And, the anger I think that Thiel felt was not like unique to him. I think that a lot of these billionaires felt that way, but Thiel is a more kind of calculating figure and someone who is willing to just like, throw everything at somebody until something sticks. And so what he did in
your
this
book,
case
you
was,
juxtapose him with Elon Musk, who you describe as more like maverick and erratic, right?
Yeah, and also stupider. Definitely Musk. like Musk, I don't think is like
As sophisticated.
as sophisticated. I can't remember if I mentioned it in the book, but there is an anecdote about Musk playing poker where he sits down at the poker table and he just keeps on going all in, losing every single time until he finally like wins one pot and he's like, okay, I'm done. Like I can't see Thiel doing that. I find Thiel to be like a more interesting person in general. Thiel's politics kind of go back 30 years to like when he was in college. He started his own campus newspaper because he felt that the campus newspaper at Stanford was like too liberal, I guess. So he's always kind of been like this. Musk just doesn't really have like a lot of, I think, internal political consistency, or didn't until maybe 5 years ago. And kind of more interestingly, Musk is, well, maybe not more interesting, but he's like completely consumed by like his insecurity, right? And Thiel, I don't think is to the extent that Thiel's insecurity drives him. I think that it's like kind of like a motivator for him to get back at people and to attack people, while Musk just like desperately wants to be loved. And then if you don't love him, he hates you forever. Thiel, I think, is like more calculating, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, well, that's actually one of the main reasons that I thought this conversation would be so important. Oh, and because, you write so much about Peter Thiel, and Peter Thiel is such a powerful person. He's so central to a lot of the politics that we're discussing and the ideological movements within the Republican Party. And I feel like, one thing that this show might be guilty of is not focusing enough on him. Focusing more on Elon Musk because he's so, cartoonish and stupid, and he does so many embarrassing things. I think Peter Thiel kind of is, like you said, more sophisticated. He kind of hides in the shadows more and pulls the strings in a more hidden way. So if you could kind of just break down for our audience the actual provable influence that Peter Thiel specifically has over the right-wing media, because I feel like there's a lot of these things where it's like, Peter Thiel invested in Rumble, but then, people that work for Rumble will deny that he has anything to do with it. And they'll make you feel stupid if you even point that out. Oh, what? You think just because he invested money, he's controlling me? He's pulling the puppet strings? Like, what are you, some conspiracy theorist? But I think that his influence does go a lot deeper than is visible on the surface. And if you could just kind of spell that out in layman's terms for our audience, how this guy specifically has amassed an army of right-wing media people, followers, whatever.
Sure. Well, I'll start with what you were just talking about. And Glenn Greenwald, who's one of the topics of the book, uses this technique quite a bit to stop criticism of him taking at least hundreds of thousands of dollars from Rumble to produce his show there. And what I would say to that is that Thiel invested in Rumble. He led a funding round in Rumble in May of 2021. It was Thiel and JD Vance led this funding round. And in August of 2021, Rumble started giving deals to people to come on to the platform to start making their shows. And one of the first ones was to Glenn. It was announced the same day as one to Tulsi Gabbard. So I think that it strains credulity to think that like there's no influence here from that money. But saying that aside,
by the way, just to cut in real quick, I remember when that happened, and they actually bragged about Tulsi's hire as proof that, oh no, we're not a right-wing media company. We just hired this prominent Democratic ex-congresswoman to do a show. See, we're platforming leftists.
yeah. I mean, she was actually the lead of the article in the Washington Post, I think, that had the exclusive on it. But it is kind of funny that with Glenn, they were like, yeah, but he is right-wing, so we'll just like whatever. But for his actual influence, though, I think his deeper influence, more than just Rumble, it goes into all the politicians that he has invested in. And if you want to go into like all of his different like cultural and news media investments, we could be sitting here for. I mean, I could just read from Malcolm Harris's Palo Alto. I mean, he has like 7 pages of just going like, one after another, and that book came out like 2 or 3 years ago, so it's only continued. Thiel has thrown tons of money into shaping cultural and media kind of narratives and thought. Like over the Dime Square stuff in New York, that little cultural scene. A lot of that is funded by Thiel. There's Thiel money in like kind of all of these different podcasts. But outside of that, sorry, were you going to say something?
No, keep going.
No, yeah, but outside of that, I would say that he is one of JD Vance's like earliest and strongest supporters. JD Vance and him, I think they worked together in Silicon Valley, and then when JD wanted to become the senator from Ohio, Thiel, I think, was one of, or if not his biggest donor. Blake Masters, failed Senate candidate from Arizona, another example. Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Ron Paul. Trump himself in 2016, not so much in 2024, but also in 2020. This guy has had his money behind a lot of the people who have shaped Republican politics over the last decade or 2 decades. And that has paid off for him in that he has like a role in the party now. He has influence. But I think that to go back to Musk, I think this is where you see Thiel's influence the most. So Thiel, one of the reasons that Thiel is so rich is that he co-founded PayPal with Elon Musk at the end of the 90s. And then they sold that to eBay. And I think they sold it for like $1 billion or something like that, which at the time was, quite a bit of money. And then it still is quite a bit of money, but at the point that these guys are
Broke
at now,
boys with $1 billion only. I don't know.
Right, yeah, only $1 billion, only a single billion. Yeah, but they both ended up with like hundreds of millions of dollars. They both invested in different things, and one of the things that Thiel did was he co-founded Palantir, which is the kind of notorious surveillance.
Okay, yeah, I have a question prep for you about that, because one of the things that I've been kind of, so again, Ro Khanna, I think there's good and bad things that you could say about the guy. I appreciate that he engages with independent media at the rate that he does. He doesn't just brush aside knuckleheads like us who are like, why the fuck are you doing this, Ro? But one of the things that we've been breaking his balls about repeatedly over here is as late as February of this year, this dude was stocking up on Palantir stocks, and we know now and we had known for a long time how involved Peter Thiel was in Palantir, obviously, and in the Trump administration. So while you're making the case that we have to oppose this fascist regime, you're also profiting off of it. As you make the case that we need to radically oppose ICE, you're actually profiting off of it, because we know for a fact Palantir, as early as the time that Ro Khanna was investing in them, was profiting off of collaborating with ICE, and he responded to public pressure and sold. But I'm just like, that shows you how even the people who are on the progressive left are being infected by this Peter Thiel money, because it's such a good stock investment, because they knew, and their accountants knew, and their stockbrokers knew, hey, you invest in this, it's going to go up, because guess who just got reelected fucking president, right? This guy's goons. And, for people who don't know, I bring it up sometimes. My background when I was going to college was going into, like, I was trying to get into venture capital, as disgusting as that sounds, right? I did not want to be poor. So I was like, fuck, what can you do to make money? You go invest in startups or whatever. Peter Thiel has this reputation as like a kingmaker in Silicon Valley. He's one of the most successful and well-known, kind of venture capital investors. He does a ton of angel investing in incubators. He really makes his presence known there. And even though Elon Musk, Sergey Brin, a lot of these other guys, they have more money in terms of Silicon Valley social capital and pernicious influence, I feel like Peter Thiel almost dwarfs all of them because of his Rolodex, right? All of the people he knows, all the dinners he's had, all of the fucking dirt he has on everyone.
I think that's really sharp, and I think that it's good to distinguish social capital from financial capital, right? Because Thiel has this reputation now as an angel investor or as a kingmaker, but for a long time he didn't, in part because he stupidly sold a bunch of his Facebook stock before Facebook like blew up. And for a long time, that was the narrative around Thiel, because early on, Palantir, just to go back to Palantir for a sec, made almost all of its money off of government contracts. In fact, the government was the only source of its income, I think, for the first like 6 or 7 years of its existence. So Thiel's outside investments weren't really paying off quite as well, although he was doing better than Mark Andreessen, who was really not doing very well except for his investment in Facebook. Now Thiel has not only like the social capital of being kingmaker, but also as Trump's kind of longtime voice in Silicon Valley, even though that kind of fell off a little bit over the last year. But I think now he's kind of back. But in 2016, he was the most prominent member of Silicon Valley to stand for Trump against Clinton, and he brought all of these like leaders into the main
and for
up
people who
into the
don't
White
have
House.
a face to the name Andreessen,
Yeah.
that's the egghead guy that was on Joe Rogan a few months ago that made the news.
Yes,
He was
yes,
a big Substack investor too, right?
Yes, a Substack investor like me, a bald guy with a beard as well. Well, actually, sorry. Just before we go to Andreessen, I just want to say one more thing about Palantir, which is the guys at Sludge. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that site. They published, I think it was a scoop, but at least it was a report on a Palantir-funded dinner for Democratic Senate leaders I think it was in March, and there is a picture of Schumer addressing them holding a check. All this stuff is on LinkedIn. Who else was there? Mark Kelly was there. Klobuchar.
Usual suspects.
Usual suspects. Yeah. I mean, like on the one hand, it's understandable. These are Senate leaders. These are people who are in charge of or who are the ranking members of these committees that Palantir is going to have an interest in. So it makes sense that they would invite them. However, given what Palantir has been doing and was obviously primed to do, like you said, under Trump, not really sure if that was the right move. But Andreessen is so in the book. Thiel, Musk, and Andreessen are kind of like the three main figures of in the Silicon Valley space who I talk about. And Andreessen is the guy who created Netscape Navigator back in the 90s, the first commercial browser, and he kind of got stomped by Microsoft and then spearheaded the antitrust movement that ended up breaking up Microsoft in the 90s, and then became an angel investor, a VC. Didn't do very well until Facebook really paid off. Now he's super invested in crypto, which is why he's been hyping that for a long time. And he's been hyping up AI. So I assume that he is, deeply invested in AI at this point too. He's a pretty slippery guy. His politics have not always been on the right, but he definitely did shift right, I think, over like the last 10 or 11 years to the point that he was like full-on Trumper by 2024. I would argue that he was in 2016 and 2020 as well, but he wasn't quite so public about it. Now, I think that's the big shift that we saw over the last year, is that a lot of these Silicon Valley guys who, for a long time were kind of like, well,
I mean, kind of like with Mark Zuckerberg, even, right? He was always, he kind of cosplayed as a liberal for a while. And now he's, Trump is actually a badass and shit like that. So I think that attitude is definitely true. The mask has kind of come off for a lot of these capitalist types. I just want
to say with Zuckerberg, I mean, like one interesting thing that I saw with him in the last 2 weeks or so is he's like, I'm just so glad that we've ended these woke programs that we put in at Facebook. These DEI things, like, these programs that we put in 2020. And it's like, man, like, we're not stupid. Like, we remember 5 years ago, because the Black Lives Matter protests were going on, you were all about this because that's what people said that they liked. So
100%.
I find he's just so transparently he's just a total nihilist. I mean, he's of all of them, I find Zuckerberg kind of like the most reprehensible in that way. Just like, I mean, I find like Musk the most. Musk disgusts me the most, but Zuckerberg, I'm just you believe in nothing, man, like nothing.
Yeah. We'll have to do another conversation at some point about Zuckerberg, because that's a whole other rabbit hole. But I do want to talk a little bit about one portion of your book, Owen. I thought this was pretty cool. First time in my memory that the Vanguard actually was mentioned in a book, an actual published book. So very cool. Thank you for including our show and your analysis here in this portion of the book. Obviously, you're talking about Glenn Greenwald and his shift related to his views on the trans community. And this is something that we discussed on the show maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, maybe even longer. It's been a while. But that was a really good discussion. I enjoyed that conversation with Glenn. And I do have a question for you, Owen, about Glenn Greenwald specifically, because obviously Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbe are two of the main figures that you write about in this book. Obviously, Glenn Greenwald has been on this show. He's been on the show like 2 or 3 or 4 times, had a pretty friendly relationship, although we've obviously been able to challenge him on air, as you mention here in the book. I'm wondering, and by the way, if Glenn happened to be listening, you're welcome to come on the show and respond to the criticisms made. Definitely not afraid of having that conversation either. I honestly think it would be pretty interesting, but I'm interested, in my opinion, Greenwald and Taibbe are on different paths at this point. I think that Taibbe is far more embarrassing. And the main reason I say that is because, he made his whole thing about free speech. So did Glenn Greenwald. For a long time, that was their main concern, right? Now, of course, the biggest threat to free speech is the Israeli censorship of, advocates for Palestine, critics of the IDF and of the genocide that's happening in Gaza. And Matt Taibbe has completely remained, he's kept his mouth shut. He claims to not have an opinion. When people challenge him on this, he'll say, I don't even know enough about what's going on to have a take. I'm just going to keep my thoughts private because I don't know enough, which is a total fucking excuse. This has been a conflict that's been unfolding throughout his entire adult life. Obviously, Matt Taibbe knows what right and wrong is, or at least he at one point did. And even if he doesn't care about Palestinian lives, viewing it through the lens of the First Amendment and freedom of speech, all that kind of stuff, of course it's important. It is the most important issue in regard to that discussion. Glenn, on the other hand, has actually done a very good job, even in the post, Trump re-election era. I think he's done a really good job, not only calling out the Trump administration, but also other people on the right, people like Ben Shapiro, a lot of other bad actors and right-wing media who completely use the defense of free speech as this, tool to get power and then abandon it as quickly as they possibly could. So I do think that there's a little bit of a difference. And I do think that Glenn, is despite my continued disagreements with him, I do think he's in a slightly different place. And I was just wondering, do you think there's a chance he could kind of break free from this rumble sphere, if he were ever to want to? Because I do think he's kind of woken up to a lot of the evils of the Trump administration and a lot of the stuff that a lot of people got duped into believing. So what's your thoughts on that?
All right. So I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'll try and keep them somewhat like lined up in coherence. So to kind of address like what you said in order. So I'll start with the book. Yes, I found that conversation that you guys had with him to be a very revealing one about his thoughts on that issue at that time. When I challenged him, so I talked to Glenn for a couple hours for this book. Like he gave me his time. We had a cordial, if occasionally combative conversation. But it was fine. It was I guess about as friendly as it could be, considering that I was writing a book that was critical of him. But he definitely gave me his time and offered his opinion on things, which I think comes out in the book. I quote him quite a bit.
I know,
but I just wanted.
That was interesting.
Yeah, and I also wanted to tell you guys that in our discussion when we were talking about this, he specifically told me to go listen to that episode to get his thoughts on that. So just so you guys know, he told me. Now, as it happened, I already had, and so I was like, "Oh, that's great that you tell me," because I actually have questions about this specifically, so we were able to talk about it. But just so you guys know, he specifically said that he wanted me to cite back to your show. So you were kind of getting, you guys were getting the
that was all Gavin. To be honest, I hadn't grown into myself so much on our show at that point. So I was was super heavily relying on
you guys. You guys just both own it. Just both own it. But I think as far as the difference between Glenn and Matt, I think there is a big difference between them. Quite honestly, I think the primary one is that Glenn is smart, and I don't think that Matt is particularly that intelligent. at this point.
I would have argued with you at one point, pretty hardcore, because Matt was a huge influence on me, and that's why it breaks my heart so much to watch what's happened to him. But I mean, when I was in business school, I was like, I took a creative writing class, and I read Bush Like Me, and I read, The Great American Bubble Machine, and I read all these works, and I was like, bro, you can't hold these opinions and then continue to go live your life the way that you know what I mean? So it's crazy to just watch him abandon all of that, because
I want to be really, really clear here that when I say that I think that Glenn is smarter than Matt, I'm not even saying that Glenn is a better writer than Matt, because I think Matt's probably a better writer than Glenn, as far as like having skill, having voice. But there's a difference between there's a difference in intelligence, and I think that for Matt, I think that the big difference between them is that I don't think that Glenn completely believes in this stuff to the extent that Matt does. And I think if you look at Glenn's career path over the last 20 years, you see somebody who has had certain principles that he has more or less adhered to, and some that have seemed flexible. So let's take Israel and Palestine, right? Glenn has been in favor of Palestinian liberation and against the Israeli apartheid regime for, I would say, pretty much his entire career, at least as far as I was able to find going back on it. The difference in the way that he talks about it now is that now he is like upset with people on the right for not adhering to what he pretends are their free speech principles and acting kind of, in his words, like liberals or like people on the left. I think that's dishonest. But I don't think it's dishonest for him to continue to say that Palestine is an issue where it is a pretty black and white issue, and and the protesting in favor of Palestine is something that you should not be penalized for, right? In the U.S., right? He's been consistent on that. His language around it has changed because now he has a right-wing audience, and now he's kind of more on the right politically. And so he is like talking to people who are on the right and saying, like, you shouldn't be like liberals and be like censorious liberals. I think that's kind of my biggest issue with Glenn's general shift on some of these issues now that it's become kind of hard to ignore how bad the speech stuff is under Trump, is that Glenn has kind of like moved to this thing where he's still implying or directly saying that there's this all-powerful, censorious, like left-wing regime within like deep state within the government, even though the Republicans control like the entire federal government at the moment, and Trump is taking these actions to ensure that the GOP is going to continue to dominate these agencies. And I think that Glenn's comments on Twitter like a month or two ago, when Trump like kind of out of his oatmeal slurry brain said something like, "Oh, we're gonna like cut the military," and Glenn was like, "See, this is like a total example of this. See," and it's like, no, and everybody, like Adam Johnson, I think, was one of the people who really got under his skin about this, but was like, "This is ridiculous. Like you're being completely insane." And Glenn got really mad about it, and now, of course, like Trump wants to increase the budget, and Glenn hasn't said anything about it. So
$1 trillion budget.
$1 trillion budget, right? So I think that's like an important piece of context to understand here for Glenn's politics on this stuff. But I would also say that Glenn is, and I think this might have something to do with kind of his lawyer brain, the way that he talks about stuff often leaves him with an out, right? He usually he's smart enough to phrase his stuff to kind of hedge it. So that if you go back and look at something that Glenn said like 2 or 3 years ago, right? If you don't know the whole context, if you don't know the context of like the discourse that's going on Twitter, if he's talking about Twitter, or you don't know, like if you're not putting the context of all the other articles that are going on and like what he's responding to, right? What he says, you might disagree with it, but you're like, oh, well, that does seem kind of reasonable. And in some cases it is, obviously. But then there are other situations when it's not, when he's taking a very, very partisan approach to an issue, or he's taking a very partisan position. And
I also think that something that you point out in the book that I
Yeah.
thought was a really, good way to put it with some of these characters, including Greenwald. It's like, it's not necessarily that they just became Republicans, but they started to view liberals as their enemy. And they started, I think you said, to perversely view people on the right as friends, folks like Tucker
Yeah,
Carlson, the list goes on. And that's kind of where I started to be like, okay, something's happening here. Even if I still kind of agree with a lot of what someone like that is saying, like it's hard to argue with, like you said, they leave themselves out sometimes, but it's kind of undeniable what side you're gravitating towards, who you're hanging out with, what circles you're, associated with, and who you're turning your fire on.
Yeah, Jim Norekas of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting made that point to me early on in reporting out the book, and I thought it was just really sharp. Like he listed off a few things that were kind of like, even by the time that I was doing the final edits on the book, were no longer kind of relevant because DeSantis was no longer such a relevant character. But he was like, like they're not saying anything about all of this stuff happening in Florida, like at the time, like the Don't Say Gay bill and all of that. But they're getting mad about AOC saying something, But I would say that Glenn's approach in that kind of being able to hedge has not only offered him a way to kind of credibly criticize the Trump administration, maybe in ways that he wouldn't be able to if he were a little more partisan. It also allows it so that maybe in the future, if he needs to pivot back to the left, which I don't think he would really do, but you never know. He like the groundwork is kind of there. Like he's been critical enough of like both sides that he could like presumably do that. Now, the reason that I'm bringing that up isn't to say that he's going to do that or that's what his aim is here, but it's to say that Matt Taibbe has gone so far in the other direction that it's impossible for him to do something like that. And not only is it impossible to do something, like his credibility is completely shot.
Dude,
I went on
bullshit
to
lawsuit for the libel over the congresswoman that nobody's even covering because it's such dog shit.
It's total bullshit. There's like, she said basically that people have said that you were like a serial sexual harasser of women, or like that's the allegation, and then asked to like put in things that made that allegation. Now, that allegation may be bullshit and maybe not, but there's nothing libelous about saying, hey, people have said this about you. Like there just isn't. And like, responding to a tweet by Aaron Rupar online does not like rise to the standard of defamation. You know what I mean? Like it's not. But even putting that aside, like I went to his Twitter account a couple times over the last 2 or 3 months when I was writing this article for The Nation, kind of like looking at Taibbe and Greenwald and Barry Weiss in the age of Trump, and it was just all like anti-vax stuff and all anti-trans stuff, and then the only stuff that wasn't that was kind of reliving Russiagate and reliving the Twitter files. And I was and am very critical of Russiagate, the kind of the liberal conspiracy theory around that. I think the Twitter files were a nothing burger. I'm just putting my cards on the table for that, but just to say that either way, it doesn't matter. Like that shit was like 3 to 5 years ago. Okay, it's like 2025 now. Like
Russiagate was 9 years ago.
Yeah, 9 years ago, right? 9 years ago, like, and for him to be,
I was in college,
for him to still be like living this stuff up like that, I think it's kind of pathetic, and I think that it just shows that he doesn't really have any ideas, because all he can do is just kind of promote these culture war things, like this like transphobic stuff and this anti-vax stuff. And then just like, play the hits. And I just don't think that that's particularly interesting. But beyond that, not only is it not particularly interesting, it's also like the most insane gutter right-wing politics you can imagine. And so, while someone like Glenn would still be able to kind of stand up for free speech on principle in some ways, even though like I would be someone who would be critical of that. But even I would like admit that like my criticism of him, while I think that it's like legit, might come across as a little pedantic, right? Compared to Taibbe, where if he started saying something like that, I think everybody would be like, "Oh, this is just ridiculous! Like you're insane."
Well, I'm glad you agree with me on that difference between the two, because they are the main characters in your book, and I do feel like there's some there's some nuance between their trajectories. I certainly hope that, Glenn comes back and joins the left at some point. I do have a soft spot for his work, and I think that he does do a pretty good job, again, like holding it down on the anti-war stuff, crusading against war with Iran, crusading against the attacks on free speech. So I do, I continue to think he does better work than the other folks, but I definitely also agree with a lot of your criticisms. I mean, that's why we had that debate that you referenced in the book. Obviously it got pretty intense there. One other question I did have for you.
Sorry, I just want to say one thing, which is that a good friend of mine was reading the book, and he just messaged me to say that, like, he was like, it's apparent through the first half of the book that, you disagree with and have a lot of criticisms for Glenn, and you guys don't probably like each other anymore or anything, but like there's still like something of like respect there somewhere. And he's like, and then I got to the Taibbe part, and it was just clear that you have like no time for his shit.
That's exactly how I feel.
Yeah. Yep. I was like, yeah, that's probably right. Sorry. So go ahead.
Like I said, I'd be more than happy for us to host Glenn on the show to get his response. Even if you guys ever wanted to chat, be happy to host something like that.
I don't think he's acknowledged the existence of the book yet. So.
Well, it can be the first time he does.
Yeah.
Either way, my last question for you, we've talked a lot about the Young Turks over here on the Vanguard. And one thing specifically that we've talked about a lot is the fact that they took a sponsorship from Polymarket. And one thing that's relevant about that is that Peter Thiel was also involved as an investor in Polymarket. A founder, really?
A founding investor.
Okay, gotcha. Do you have any insight into Polymarket? And do you think that the Young Turks could be looked at as another one of these examples where someone like Peter Thiel has kind of, gotten involved and maybe had a say as far as the commentary and coverage goes?
I know that you guys cover the Young Turks a lot. I don't pay a lot of attention to them, mainly because I don't think that within the context of like what I'm working on here is that they're not important. I don't think that they are like, they're not like the kind of people who have like the thing about the people in the book here is that they have like mainstream and independent media crossover, right? At this point, I think that and again, I catch most of my stuff from watching clips and watching commentary on them, but these guys just seem insane to me at this point. Like they really do. Like there doesn't. Yeah, they do. The main two, Chen and Anna, there, like they just seem completely nuts to me. It's not surprising to me that they would take money from Polymarket, and I say in the book, like I took money from David Sachs, even though I didn't really know who he was at the time, but I did a show on Call-In.
So did we, and then we got fired when we started bitching about how Peter Thiel sucks.
Oh, really?
On air, bro. We didn't give a fuck. Well, we should have a little bit because we were broke as hell at that time. But anyway, you know what I mean?
That's interesting. Yeah. They never gave me any editorial direction, but so what I'm trying to say is that I don't, I'm not going to sit here and like judge them for taking money from Polymarket or having Polymarket like sponsor their show. Other than to say what I find distasteful about it is how the reaction that I've seen that they've had to people being critical of that. Like if you are going to put yourself on TV or whatever streaming for hours a day and present yourself as the leaders of a political movement and like important figures in the discourse, etc., then you have to expect that there's going to be some criticism of you when you do things that don't align with the politics that you're espousing, right? And these guys, their reaction to that has just been to completely melt down, like every single time that they're challenged. They have a total like freak out from what I can tell. And I think that if you're going to talk about like the problems with rapacious capitalism and the tech world and Republican politics and the right wing, and then take money from a company like Polymarket, which, as you said, has a funding round that came from Peter Thiel,
and the guy that founded Ethereum, like it's not like there's savory characters involved.
Yeah, you could just say, hey, you know what? They're the people who are funding us right now. That's the reality of the business of media. And I don't know for a fact, but I'm pretty sure that like people would have like moved on. But like they overreact to things and it just gets critical. So I guess that's kind of my long way of saying that I don't really know like what I don't really know if they are being pushed to go to the right because of this, or if their kind of shift to the right on a lot of these issues is based in their actual politics. But ultimately, I wonder if it really matters. I mean, like I argue in the book, like it's not just a one-to-one. It's not that once Matt Taibbe got selected by Elon Musk for the Twitter files, that he kind of like went to the right. He was already on the right before that. Why had he gone to the right? Well, there are a lot of different factors that explain it. Part of it's audience, part of it's like the nuance of like getting older and having different politics and different experiences that change the way that you think about things. So I guess I'm kind of like talking myself into convincing myself that maybe the Young Turks are kind of a good example of this, because I think that maybe they are. I don't know. I definitely saw that they got mad at Larry David for which I think
We're
you guys
about to
are
talk about that next.
Yeah, for making fun of Bill Maher, and that's just kind of, to me.
Oh yeah, they'll go on Glenn Beck, but they think that Sam Cedar is a low rent grifter. Like, you know what I mean? Like, say what you will about Sam Cedar, it's not the fucking Vanguard, bro. Like, he's a credentialed man. Like,
well, you know also like Glenn Beck. I mean, come on, man. Like you want to talk about grifter? Like, this guy is, and also he's insane. And finally, just like, why are you defending Bill Maher? Yeah. There's no reason for you to ever do that. You don't ever have to do that, but they are, I guess. So.
Well, Owen, really appreciate you coming on the show today. I thought it was a great chat. Long time coming, as we mentioned. You're the author of Owned. People can buy it wherever they buy books. It's right behind you. We have a copy that Gavin ordered and a PDF that I was looking at this morning. It's really good stuff. Very well argued. Even as a guy who, I kind of found myself in the same shoes as you. Not that, we've you looked up to these guys in a way that's pretty clear at one point. You know what I mean? Particularly Glenn, you write about how you applied at The Intercept in 2014 and that, you got your, what was that guy's name? Alex Morse. Gavin and I were talking about how that it was a long time since we'd heard that name, but we covered it at the time on our show. Just, the fact that, nobody wants to watch this happen. You know what I mean? Like, I get constantly frustrated by Glenn like acting like JD Vance has any kind of principles other than serving Donald Trump, or that, you know what I mean? And I'm like, I know you're smarter than this, dog. Like, why is this happening? So I thought that there were some reasonable arguments that you made that were, pretty nailing his balls a little bit. So
appreciate it, guys.
Yeah, take care, man.
Shout out to you. Thanks for stopping by, Owen. Really appreciate it. And yeah, everyone check out the book Owned. You can own it yourself. You can Owned. And it's a good read. It's really entertaining, informative. He really lays out this whole kind of evolution or de-evolution, however you want to put it, and pretty hard to argue with terms. So glad to have that conversation. Thought a lot of interesting insights came out of that.
And it's not bloviating, right? I read for maybe an hour and a half this morning. I felt like I was pretty well prepped. I didn't read like line for line everything, but I found myself reading different paragraphs that I, found myself interested in. And there was a lot of it. And I got through a decent chunk of it pretty quickly. It was a fast read, densely packed with information, but not boring. The exact kind of book that you should be writing in 2025. Sounds like I'm giving it glowing praise. I haven't finished it yet, but you know what I mean? People tend to overwrite when they write a book. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They'll really get into the nitty gritty that doesn't matter. And I feel like he did a good job of just, staying punchy.
Look out the door if you hear an ambulance. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there. Be there. The Vanguard will be
there.